Come with me. You need to see this yourself. That's what the old security guard said. Quiet, uneasy, like he wished he didn't have to be the one to say it. I just paid for our things. My wife had stepped aside to take a call. Nothing strange about that until this. I followed him, heart suddenly heavy for no reason I could name. We turned a corner near the dressing rooms. He pointed to a live surveillance feed playing on a back monitor. And that's when I saw her. My wife, the woman I had shared 17 years and 2 kids with, pressed up against the wall, laughing into the phone, flirting with someone else. Her voice carried through the thin wall. I told him I was on the phone with the school. He's so easy. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching her twirl her hair while she whispered, "Just one more night and then I'll tell him." I realized I'd been living in a house built on my own blind spots.
The fluorescent lights of the department store hummed overhead as Nolan Chase completed what should have been an ordinary transaction, sliding his credit card across the counter while his wife stepped away to answer her phone. 17 years of marriage had taught him to recognize her patterns, the way she tilted her head when talking to their kids' teachers, the slight tension in her shoulders when dealing with her mother, the casual ease of routine conversations. Nothing about this moment seemed unusual until the old security guard approached him with an expression that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "Come with me," the guard said quietly, his voice tinged with reluctance, as if he wished someone else could deliver whatever news he carried. "You need to see this yourself." Those words hung in the air like a verdict before the crime had even been named. Nolan followed, his heart suddenly heavy with a dread he couldn't yet articulate, turning the corner near the dressing rooms where a back monitor displayed live surveillance feeds. And there she was, his wife, the woman with whom he had built a life, raised 2 children, survived financial struggles and celebrated victories, pressed against a wall, her body language speaking a language he had never seen her use with him in years. She laughed into the phone, her face animated with an expression of pure joy and flirtation, her voice carrying through the thin wall with devastating clarity. "I told him I was on the phone with the school," she said, her tone light and conspiratorial. "He's so easy." The words struck him like physical blows, each syllable rewriting 17 years of shared history. Nolan stood frozen, watching her twirl her hair the way she used to do when they first dated, hearing her whisper with breathless anticipation, "Just one more night and then I'll tell him." In that moment, standing before a grainy security monitor in the back room of a department store, Nolan Chase's entire understanding of his life fractured. He had always believed that loyalty meant never checking the shadows, that trust equated to peace, that his dedication to their marriage created a fortress impervious to betrayal. But the woman on that screen, laughing and planning with someone else, revealed the truth he had been too blind to see. He had been living in a house built on his own blind spots. The security guard looked at him with eyes that had witnessed this scene before, recognizing the expression of a man whose world had just tilted off its axis. "I figured you'd want to know," he said simply. Nolan nodded, his hands steady despite the storm building inside him. He walked back out to the store floor with measured steps, placed the shopping bags carefully in the car, and when his wife returned moments later, still glowing from her conversation, still wearing that smile, he kissed her forehead with deliberate tenderness. She had no idea that in that single moment, everything had changed. She had no idea that he had already started the timer on the end of their marriage, or that the man she thought she knew so well had just transformed into someone far more dangerous than she could imagine, a man armed with clarity, discipline, and an unshakable commitment to truth. She slid into the passenger seat with the casualness of someone whose deception remained safely hidden, her face still radiant from whatever lies she had just told. "Sorry," she said breezily, buckling her seatbelt. "School stuff." Nolan smiled back at her, his voice steady and unremarkable. "No problem. Everything good?" She nodded, leaning over to kiss his cheek, not a single hint of guilt touching her voice or shadowing her expression. But inside Nolan, something fundamental had shifted. A switch had been thrown, a door had closed, a new version of himself had awakened. He didn't rage or demand answers or confront her with what he had seen. Instead, he observed. That night, he lay beside her in their bed, wide awake in the darkness, listening to her breathing patterns and memorizing the rhythm of her sleep. He noticed how she clutched her phone under the pillow like it needed protection, how her fingers twitched slightly when notifications vibrated silently against the mattress. He had 1,000 questions burning through his mind, each one demanding immediate answers, demanding confrontation and explanation. But Nolan Chase also had discipline, and that discipline, forged through 7 years as a military analyst before he ever entered construction management, was what made him truly dangerous now. His training had taught him to see patterns most people missed, to identify inconsistencies and behavioral tells, to build cases from fragments of evidence. And suddenly, his wife was full of them. The new gym bag that appeared in her car but never seemed to get unpacked or used, the mystery volunteer nights that started appearing on the calendar with vague descriptions, the perfume that didn't match the brand she had worn for the past decade, something sweeter and more youthful, the phone screen that was now locked with a 6-digit passcode when she used to leave it open on the kitchen counter without a second thought. Each detail registered in his mind like data points on a grid, forming patterns he couldn't yet fully see but knew were there. But Nolan said nothing. He didn't ask about the gym bag or question the volunteer schedule or comment on the new perfume. Instead, he began quietly rebuilding something in the shadows of their marriage, a log, a timeline, a case file. He tracked every outing with meticulous precision, noting departure times and return times, documenting every excuse and every shift in her tone or behavior. He observed which nights she showered immediately upon coming home and which nights she didn't, which days she was distracted and distant, and which days she overcompensated with affection. And then, after 3 days of silent observation, Nolan made a single phone call to an old friend, a digital forensic consultant he had once helped through a brutal custody battle. The man owed him a favor, and favors in that world carried weight. Within 48 hours, Nolan had access to every deleted message from her phone, every cloud-stored voice note she thought had vanished, every digital breadcrumb she had tried to sweep away. The voice he heard in those recordings wasn't just hers, it was his too, the other man's voice, conspiring and planning and laughing about the life they would build once she finally told her husband the truth. And then Nolan found the photo, time-stamped just 12 minutes after he had paid for their groceries that day. The photo stopped Nolan cold in a way the surveillance footage somehow hadn't. It wasn't the angle or composition, wasn't even what they were doing, just standing near each other in the dressing room corridor, his hand barely brushing hers in a gesture that could have been accidental to anyone who didn't know better. But Nolan knew better now. What gutted him wasn't the proximity or the touch, it was her face. She looked relaxed in that photo, genuinely lit up from within, wearing that subtle half-smile he remembered from their early years together, before children and mortgages and the daily grind of life had hardened around them like concrete. That expression used to belong to him, a private thing shared between them in quiet moments. Now it belonged to someone else, given freely to a man whose name Nolan didn't even know yet. He stared at the image longer than he should have, forensically examining every pixel, torturing himself with the evidence of what he had lost without even realizing it was slipping away. This was his education in what betrayal actually felt like. Not the Hollywood version with explosive arguments and thrown dishes, but this cold, quiet nausea that started behind his ribs and spread through his chest, never quite leaving, just becoming part of his baseline existence. Nolan Chase, a man learning in real time how to function while his foundation crumbled beneath him. But he didn't confront her with the photo. He didn't print it out and leave it on her pillow or send it to her phone with a devastating message. Instead, he upgraded his plan, expanding his strategy from simple observation to comprehensive action. First, he contacted a family law attorney, someone discreet, effective, and trained in pre-litigation investigation. They met in a downtown office with frosted glass doors and opened a folder that would eventually contain the complete documentation of his wife's betrayal. The attorney explained the process with clinical precision, established timeline,
Secure assets, document everything, prepare for worst-case scenarios. Together, they built a case that would hold up under any scrutiny. Next, Nolan scheduled a meeting with their financial advisor, a man they had trusted with their retirement planning and investment strategy for nearly a decade. He asked one simple, devastating question. If a marital asset is being moved in secret, how early can we trace it? The advisor leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, considering the implications. Depends on how clever she thinks she is, he replied. Turns out, not very clever at all. Within days, the financial investigation revealed that his wife had been systematically siphoning small amounts from their joint account, transferring the money to a private debit card registered under the name of a fake LLC. The amounts were modest enough to avoid immediate detection. 200 here, 300 there, never enough to trigger alerts, but accumulating steadily over months. And the name of that LLC, when Nolan saw it printed on the corporate filing documents, made his blood run cold. It matched his initials, the other man's initials. They had created a financial entity together, a shadow structure for their shadow life. Nolan didn't flinch when he saw the evidence. He simply signed the documents his attorney placed before him, authorizing the freezing of joint accounts and the legal protection of assets.
The house became Nolan's next priority, the physical foundation of everything they had built together, now transformed into a strategic asset that required protection. Years ago, when they'd first purchased the property, his father had co-signed the loan during a period when Nolan's credit was still recovering from an early business failure. That co-signature had seemed like a minor detail at the time, a family kindness that allowed them to secure better terms. But it also meant that certain clauses in the deed gave Nolan unilateral control in specific circumstances. Circumstances his attorney now explained could be activated immediately. Within 72 hours, the house deed was legally restructured. His wife couldn't sell it, couldn't leverage it for loans, couldn't use it as collateral for any financial maneuvering. The asset was frozen, protected, removed from her reach entirely. She didn't know yet, was still going about her daily routine completely unaware that the safety net she thought she had been weaving was already being systematically dismantled, thread by thread. Nolan had erased her escape route before she even knew she needed one. But the most devastating piece of evidence came from the LLC itself. His forensic consultant had done more than just recover deleted messages. He had traced the digital footprints of every transaction, every login, every shared document stored in cloud accounts. The LLC wasn't just a bank account, it was a blueprint for a future they had been planning together. Rental applications for apartments in another city, travel itineraries for trips scheduled 3 months out, even a shared Pinterest board with home decor ideas, furniture arrangements, paint colors for walls they would choose together. They had been building a life in the margins of his marriage, and every detail was documented, time-stamped, preserved. Nolan compiled everything into a single folder. Bank statements showing the systematic transfers, text logs revealing the planning and deception, photos capturing moments of intimacy and conspiracy, the LLC filing documents with its damning initials, and her digital fingerprints on every transaction. The folder grew thick with evidence, irrefutable and comprehensive, a complete narrative of betrayal that would withstand any attempt at denial or deflection. And then, 3 days before he planned to execute the final phase of his strategy, Nolan did something that would change the entire trajectory of what was to come. He reserved a conference room at a quiet downtown co-working space. The room was clean, professional, forgettable, with neutral gray walls and a simple wooden table. He arranged 2 chairs on one side, facing a single chair on the other. He placed a legal pad on the table, a pen beside it, and one manila envelope containing every piece of evidence he had gathered. His wife thought they were meeting a potential investor for his construction business, a networking opportunity he had mentioned casually over dinner the previous week. The other man, whose name Nolan now knew, whose face he had studied in a dozen photos, whose voice he had heard in countless recordings, thought he was showing up to discuss expansion plans for a joint venture. Neither of them knew the meeting was with Nolan. Neither understood they had been invited to the same room at the same time.
Neither realized that the man they had both underestimated had spent weeks preparing for this single moment, and that when they walked through that door, everything they thought they knew about their secret relationship would detonate in their faces.
The morning of the meeting, Nolan woke before dawn and went through his routine with mechanical precision. He showered, dressed in one of his better suits, the charcoal gray one his wife had bought him for their 15th anniversary, and ate breakfast alone in the kitchen while she slept upstairs, still clutching her phone under the pillow. He felt strangely calm, the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and having eliminated every variable you can control. The anxiety of the past weeks, the sleepless nights of observation and planning had crystallized into something harder and more focused. He was ready. He arrived at the co-working space 90 minutes early, checked the room one final time, and positioned the envelope at the center of the table where it couldn't be missed. The manila folder seemed innocuous enough, but Nolan knew the devastation it contained, the complete evisceration of their lives, rendered in bank statements and timestamps and their own words. He sat in his chair, the single chair facing the two empty ones, and waited. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Running a few minutes late, traffic on the bridge. See you soon," followed by a heart emoji. He didn't respond. 20 minutes later, another text, this time from an unknown number he now recognized as belonging to him. "In the lobby. Which floor?" Nolan typed back the floor number and room designation, nothing more. And then he waited, listening to the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system, watching the seconds tick by on the conference room's wall clock. They arrived together, not holding hands, but walking close enough that their bodies moved in unconscious synchronization, the kind of physical familiarity that develops between people who have spent significant intimate time together. Through the glass panel beside the door, Nolan watched them approach down the hallway, watched his wife laugh at something the other man said, watched him touch her elbow briefly as he reached forward to open the door. The moment they stepped into the conference room and saw Nolan sitting there alone, everything changed. Her face drained of color instantly, all the blood seeming to rush away from her features, leaving her pale and frozen. The other man, younger than Nolan had expected, wearing a blazer that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, carrying himself with the false confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, froze like a rookie deer on a rifle range, his hand still on the door handle, his brain clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. The air in the room seemed to compress, all the oxygen suddenly too thin to breathe. His wife's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The other man's eyes darted between Nolan and the envelope on the table, already understanding on some instinctive level that whatever was inside that folder would destroy them. Nolan stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. His face was a mask of absolute neutrality, which somehow made the moment even more terrifying. "Sit," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command that comes from years of military discipline. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. And despite everything, despite their guilt and their fear and their desperate wish to be anywhere else, they obeyed. They lowered themselves into the chairs across from him with the mechanical movements of people whose bodies were operating on autopilot while their minds raced through terrible calculations. His wife's hands trembled as she placed her purse on the floor beside her chair. The other man tried to maintain composure, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that Nolan could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Neither of them reached for each other. The easy intimacy from moments before completely evaporated, replaced by the sudden understanding that they were facing something far more dangerous than they had imagined. Nolan remained standing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch and grow uncomfortable, letting them marinate in their fear and confusion. Then he slowly pushed the manila envelope across the table toward them, the sound of paper sliding across wood impossibly loud in the quiet room. His wife stared at it like it was a live grenade. "I can explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible, already knowing how inadequate those words were. Nolan's expression didn't change. "I'm not here for an explanation," he replied, his tone measured and clinical. "I'm here to end the story you two started behind my back."
The other man finally found his voice, leaning forward slightly in what Nolan recognized as an attempt to appear reasonable and calm. "Look, you have no right to ambush us like this. Whatever you think—" Nolan laughed. Not a big dramatic laugh. Just once, a short bark of genuine amusement at the audacity. "I have no right?" he repeated. "You ambushed a marriage. You conspired with my wife to steal from our joint accounts, to build a false company with your initials, to plan a future using resources and time that belonged to our family. I'm just returning the favor, legally." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a second document, this one folded in thirds. He unfolded it with deliberate slowness and placed it on the table beside the envelope. "I've already filed for separation. The house is frozen. She can't sell it, can't leverage it, can't touch it. The joint bank accounts are under investigation for fraud, and the false LLC you two created has been flagged by forensic accountants." He shifted his gaze to the other man, his eyes cold and absolute. "And you should probably call a lawyer before the IRS does, because tax fraud on a fake corporate entity tends to attract attention." His wife was shaking now, her whole body trembling with the realization that this wasn't a confrontation she could talk her way out of, wasn't a situation where tears or apologies or explanations would matter. This was the systematic dismantling of everything she thought she had been cleverly building in secret. "Nolan, please," she started, but he held up one hand. "I'm not finished," he said. "What neither of you understood is that I spent 7 years as a military analyst before construction management. You learn things in that work, how to track patterns, how to build cases, how to be patient when patience matters most. You both thought I was easy, that I trusted too much to see what was right in front of me. You were wrong." Then Nolan stood, straightening his jacket. "You two started this behind my back. Now you can finish it facing forward. Together." He walked toward the door, and neither of them tried to stop him. As Nolan drove away from the conference room, his phone buzzed with a text from his sister Rachel. "Landed. Where are you?" She had booked a flight the moment he sent her the complete files 3 days ago. No questions asked, no lectures delivered, just one terse message that captured her entire philosophy. Don't let her spin the narrative. I'll be there Thursday. And true to her word, she was. Rachel Chase was everything his wife had never been: direct, unflinching, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting family. As a divorce attorney who had built her practice representing clients in high-conflict separations, and as a single mother who had survived her own betrayal years earlier, she had zero tolerance for the kind of manipulation Nolan's wife had deployed. She understood intimately how quickly narratives could be twisted, how effectively guilty parties could reframe themselves as victims if given enough space and time. By the time Rachel arrived at Nolan's house, the house his wife could no longer access, the first wave of his wife's counteroffensive had already begun. She had started texting mutual friends, feeding them carefully constructed versions of events that painted her as someone trapped in an emotionally distant marriage, someone who had made mistakes born from loneliness rather than calculated deception. The word cheating never appeared in her messages. The financial fraud wasn't mentioned at all. Instead, she spoke vaguely about misunderstandings and growing apart and difficult times that made me question everything. It was a masterclass in narrative manipulation, designed to generate sympathy before the full truth could spread. But Nolan had anticipated this move. He had already sent the truth ahead of her carefully curated lies. Not to everyone, but to the people who mattered most. The friends whose opinions would shape wider perceptions. He didn't editorialize or add emotional commentary. He simply shared facts. Time-stamped bank statements, court filing documents, the LLC registration with the other man's initials, selected text messages that were undeniably explicit. One friend called him within an hour of receiving the documents. "Nolan, if this is true, she just nuked her own life," the friend said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Nolan didn't reply, didn't gloat or elaborate. He simply said, "It's all verifiable," and ended the call. The truth didn't need his advocacy. It spoke clearly enough on its own. Rachel and Nolan met with his attorney Friday morning in the same downtown office where this had all begun. She brought additional paperwork, documents that would accelerate the entire process. Emergency protective orders, enhanced asset protection clauses, custody arrangements preemptively outlined in case his wife tried to weaponize their children as leverage. Rachel reviewed everything with the precision of someone who had seen every possible variation of this situation, anticipating moves before they could be made. Then she looked at Nolan across the conference table, her expression serious and searching. "Are you doing this for payback or peace?" she asked. The question hit him harder than he expected, cutting through all the strategic planning and evidence gathering to the core question he had been avoiding. This wasn't just about catching them, or exposing them, or even punishing them. It was about who he would become on the other side of this devastation, what kind of man would emerge from the ashes of his marriage. "Peace," Nolan said finally. Rachel nodded once, satisfied. "Then let's finish this clean." That evening, his wife showed up at the house unannounced, the house she apparently still thought of as partially hers, despite everything that had happened. She pulled into the driveway just after sunset, her car headlights sweeping across the front windows where Nolan sat with his children, watching a movie they had chosen together. He saw her through the window, watched her walk up to the front door with a confidence that was about to be shattered. She reached for her keys, found the right one, and inserted it into the lock. It didn't turn. She tried again, jiggling the key, applying more pressure, her frustration building with each failed attempt. Then she tried the security code on the keypad, punching in the 6 digits she had used for years. The system beeped an error, the red light flashing rejection. Nolan had changed everything. New locks installed by a professional locksmith that morning, security codes reset to sequences only he knew, the entire house transformed into a fortress she could no longer breach. She stood on the porch for 10 minutes, illuminated by the motion sensor light, not knocking or calling out, just crying into her hands, while the cameras Nolan had recently upgraded captured everything in high definition. She didn't know he was watching through the security app on his phone, didn't know that this footage would matter more than she could imagine, or that her employer would see it within days. Her employer was a private healthcare group with strict ethical standards and a reputation to protect. Their employee handbook contained a crystal-clear clause that Nolan had researched thoroughly. Any employee involved in financial misconduct, patient trust violations, or actions that bring reputational harm to the organization may be subject to immediate investigation and suspension pending review. His wife hadn't just cheated on her husband and defrauded their joint accounts. She had used the company's corporate travel card to pay for 2 of their weekend trips with her affair partner, trips she had booked under the guise of attending professional training conferences that never actually existed. And Nolan had the receipts, literal receipts, along with hotel confirmations, restaurant charges, and calendar entries that proved she was nowhere near the conferences she claimed to attend. On Monday morning, an anonymous email arrived in the HR department's general inbox. It contained no threatening language, no emotional appeals, just a simple statement. This employee may have misused company resources. Documentation attached. The attachments included expense reports, travel card statements, and calendar screenshots showing the discrepancy between claimed conferences and actual activities. HR had no choice but to investigate. When his wife was called into a meeting with Human Resources and her department supervisor that afternoon, she tried desperately to spin the situation as personal drama spilling inappropriately into her professional life. "My husband is retaliating because our marriage is ending," she explained, her voice carrying the tremor of someone who knew her explanation sounded weak even as she spoke it. "This is about a divorce, not about my work performance or ethics." But organizational policy doesn't care about feelings or marital problems. It cares about evidence, about fiduciary responsibility, about protecting the company from liability. The documentation was irrefutable, the misuse of corporate resources undeniable. She was placed on immediate administrative leave, investigation pending, her access to company systems suspended, her professional reputation hanging by a thread that was fraying by the hour. Her voicemail to Nolan that night was 6 minutes and 43 seconds long, a rambling journey through every stage of desperate emotion. It started with blame,
her voice sharp and accusatory. "You're destroying my career because you can't handle that I was unhappy. You're vindictive and cruel, and you're using your privilege to ruin me." Then it shifted to begging, her tone cracking with tears. "Please, Nolan, please call them and tell them this was a mistake, that you were angry and sent those documents without thinking. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want. Just please don't take my job." Then came a long silence, just the sound of her breathing and occasional sniffles. And finally, rage, pure and undiluted. "You don't get to destroy me just because you're hurt. You don't get to play God with my life. This isn't justice, it's revenge, and you're going to regret this." Nolan listened to the entire message once, then deleted it without responding. He was sitting with his children, watching a movie they had chosen, something animated with talking animals and predictable jokes that made them laugh. They sat on either side of him on the couch, eating popcorn from a shared bowl, their bodies relaxed and easy in a way they hadn't been in months. His wife's presence had always introduced tension into the house, her moods swinging unpredictably and pulling everyone sideways into her emotional weather patterns. Now there was just peace, just the simple joy of a father and his kids spending time together without walking on eggshells. And that's when Nolan knew with absolute certainty that this was the life worth protecting, not the one he had lost, but the one he was building. The next day, Nolan met with his lawyer and Rachel one final time to review the status of everything they had set in motion. The division of assets was proceeding smoothly, the custody arrangements were being formalized with heavy preference toward Nolan given the documented instability and fraud. The protective orders were in place. Everything seemed wrapped up, finished, ready to move into the final administrative phases of dissolution. But then Rachel pulled out one last file from her briefcase, a folder Nolan hadn't seen before. She slid it across the table with an expression that was equal parts grim and satisfied. "You ready to see what he's been hiding?" she asked. Nolan blinked, confused. "I thought we got everything on him. The LLC, the financial entanglement, everything." Rachel shook her head slowly. "Not this. This goes deeper." She opened the file, and Nolan found himself staring at public records from 3 different states, court filings, legal documents, archived news articles that had been carefully compiled and cross-referenced. And there, buried in the documentation, was something that sent ice water through his veins. A restraining order filed 4 years ago by another woman using her maiden name against the same man who had been sleeping with his wife. The same man, different city, identical patterns. The restraining order accused him of coercion, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse. The language in the legal filing was chilling in its specificity, controlling behavior, isolation tactics, threats both explicit and implied. The case never made headlines, was settled quietly out of court with non-disclosure agreements and sealed records, deliberately buried. But it existed, documented and verifiable, a paper trail of predatory behavior. Rachel had found it through her network of legal contacts, the kind of information that doesn't appear in standard background checks, but exists in the interconnected web of court systems for those who know how to look. Nolan stared at the documents spread across the table, his mind reeling with the implications. This man didn't just betray him or seduce his wife. This man had a history, a documented pattern of targeting vulnerable women, manipulating them financially and emotionally, and disappearing when consequences approached. And his wife, in her pursuit of whatever fantasy she thought she was building, had brought this predator into proximity with his children, into the margins of his family's life. In that moment, Nolan stopped being the man who just wanted peace and closure. Because now this wasn't just about his marriage or his wounded pride or even his wife's betrayal. This was about preventing another woman from experiencing what the previous victim had documented, about protecting his children from a manipulator who had proven himself dangerous, about accountability that extended beyond personal grievance into something larger. He made one phone call to the HR department of his wife's employer. He didn't threaten or demand or even explain everything. He simply provided a public link to the court records, a URL that led to the archived restraining order and case filing. "I thought you should know who your employee has been associating with, given that this person may have been on company premises during her claimed conference trips," he said simply. Then he hung up. The response was swift and devastating.
His wife's administrative suspension became permanent termination within 48 hours, not solely because of the misused travel expenses, though that alone would have justified dismissal, but because she had brought someone with a documented history of coercion and manipulation into contact with patients and staff during those fraudulent trips. The healthcare organization's liability exposure was simply too great, the optics too terrible, the risk too high. She called Nolan from a prepaid phone number that night, her voice stripped of all pretense and pride. "Please," she whispered, "you've done enough. I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my future. Please just stop." Nolan answered calmly, his voice carrying no triumph or satisfaction, just simple factual truth. "No, I haven't done anything. I just stopped covering for you. I stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. Everything that's happened to you is the direct result of what you did." Then he hung up, and this time when she tried calling back, he blocked the number. The next morning, the other man finally reached out directly for the first time since the conference room confrontation. No threats, no attempts at intimidation or negotiation, just a single text message. "Let's meet. We need to talk about this situation like adults." Nolan showed the message to Rachel, who read it and immediately understood the subtext. "He's trying to gauge your weakness," she said, "trying to see if you can be reasoned with, bought off, or intimidated. Don't give him anything." So Nolan didn't reply. Instead, he called a former client, someone who worked in private security and risk mitigation, someone who owed him a favor from a construction project that had been completed under budget and ahead of schedule. Within hours, the man who thought he was just dating a married woman was served with a comprehensive legal complaint and a cease and desist order tied to financial entanglement, harassment, and prior documented conduct.
His silence after receiving those legal documents spoke louder than any apology or justification ever could. He vanished from the situation completely, blocking Nolan's wife on all platforms, cutting off contact so abruptly that she was left spinning in the wreckage he had helped create, now abandoned by the person for whom she had destroyed her life. But there was still one final moment that needed to happen, one last conversation that would close this chapter definitively. Because despite everything she had done, despite all the lies and betrayal and fraud, his wife had requested to see Nolan in person one final time. She arrived 10 minutes early to the cafe Nolan had suggested, the same place where they had once chosen their children's names over coffee and pancakes 17 years ago, back when the future had seemed limitless and their love had felt unbreakable. Now she sat across from him wearing no makeup, no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. She was just the woman he had married nearly 2 decades ago, only now completely stripped of the mask she had worn for the past 2 years, maybe longer. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, decades older than her actual age. The weight of consequences had carved itself into her features, reshaping her into someone he barely recognized. "I know I don't deserve kindness," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the cafe. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything." Nolan didn't answer immediately. He just watched her, studying this person who had shared his life for 17 years, trying to reconcile the woman he had loved with the stranger who had betrayed him so thoroughly. "I didn't think you'd find out," she continued, needing to fill the silence. "Not because you're stupid or unobservant, just because you trusted me too much to look, and I used that trust like a weapon against you." Nolan nodded once, acknowledging the truth of her statement without absolving her of responsibility. She reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled something out, sliding it across the table between them. It was a photograph, creased and worn from being carried around. Their wedding day. 2 young people smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from believing you found forever. "You can tear it up, burn it, throw it away," she said. "I just didn't want to be the only one looking at it anymore. Didn't want to be the only one remembering what we used to be." Nolan stared at the photo for a long moment, seeing those 2 kids who had no idea how fragile their forever would prove to be, how easily trust could be shattered, how thoroughly love could be betrayed. Then he carefully folded the photograph and placed it in his jacket pocket. "I'm not here to punish you," he said finally,
his voice even and measured. "But I'm also not here to save you from what you've built. You made choices, and now you're living with them." She bit her lip, and finally the tears came, streaming down her face unchecked. "Will you ever forgive me?" she asked. Nolan stood up, preparing to leave. "I already did," he said. "That's how I let go."
She didn't follow him out of the cafe or call after him or make any final desperate plea. She just sat there, alone, at the table where they had once planned their future, crying over the version of her life she never thought she would lose, mourning not just the marriage, but the person she used to be before she made the choices that had led her here. Nolan walked to his car, turned on the engine, and sat for a moment in the driver's seat before pulling out of the parking lot. He felt lighter somehow, as if the conversation had released some weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Forgiveness, he was learning, wasn't about excusing what she had done or pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. It was about refusing to let her choices continue to poison his future, about releasing the anger that would have eventually consumed him from the inside out. He drove home slowly, taking the long route through neighborhoods he and his wife used to walk through together on weekend mornings, past the park where they used to take their children when they were small, past all the landmarks of a life that no longer existed. And with each familiar location, he felt another thread of attachment loosen and fall away. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he felt fundamentally different, not healed, not whole, but changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. His children were waiting for him inside, had ordered pizza for dinner and set up a board game on the dining room table. They looked up when he entered, their faces bright and uncomplicated, and his daughter asked, "Ready to play, Dad?" And he was ready. Ready to be fully present with them instead of distracted by suspicion and surveillance. Ready to build something new on honest foundations instead of maintaining illusions. Ready to model for them what it looked like to face devastation with integrity, to demand accountability without becoming consumed by revenge, to choose truth even when it was excruciating. They played the board game for 2 hours, laughing and trash-talking and just being together in a way they hadn't been able to when the house was filled with lies and tension. And when his children finally went to bed, Nolan stood at his bedroom window looking out at the neighborhood, at the ordinary houses filled with their own complicated stories. And he thought about the journey from that moment in the department store security room to this quiet night. He had learned that betrayal wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. The worst thing was losing yourself in response to it, allowing someone else's choices to corrupt your own character and values. He had learned that love and trust were different things and that you could forgive someone while still refusing to allow them access to hurt you again. He had learned that closure wasn't something someone else could give you. It was something you built for yourself through choices and boundaries and the daily discipline of moving forward. The difference between a storm and a reset, he realized, was simply what you chose to build afterward. And Nolan Chase had already started building. Not a fortress against future pain, because that was impossible, but a life grounded in clarity and truth and the unwavering commitment to protect what actually mattered. Home to his children, home to himself, home to truth.